I'd like to introduce our next panel, Through Lines, from Past into Present, the Contemporary Climate. And our facilitator is Rod Ventura. He's been a member of JACL Players since the company received its first New Mexico Humanities Council grant to present, quote, Asian American legacy stories, an anthology of Filipino, Chinese, and Japanese stories sponsored by the Maxwell Museum in 2014. A former attorney and deputy director of the New Mexico Educational Retirement Board, he has recently been appointed Indian Probate Judge in the U.S. Department of the Interior in Santa Fe. So I'd like to introduce Rod to you. You've seen him already in another guise.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much. I just want to say it's great. This is the best time to have a panel at a meeting. I know it sounds like I'm being facetious about that, but I'm not, because when I was a long time ago, when I was in school, at the end of every class, I had one professor who would say, okay, what have we learned from this? And here's an opportunity now to pause and think about what have we learned about from today. So we've heard a lot of history today. We went back to World War II, and the last panel went back 20 years. I want to take us a little bit lesser back in time to this morning. And if you were here, you heard Aiko Allen do her introduction, and she didn't talk just about the Japanese internment. She also talked about Native American rights. She also talked about immigration, and she also talked about the Ukraine. So it goes to, it kind of dovetails into what have we learned here? And have we actually learned anything? And that question of, are we doomed to repeat history? Or does history just always keep doing the same thing over and over again? I don't have an answer for that question. I don't know if we'll have an answer for that question, but I want to start this dialogue a little bit with our presenters. We have three great presenters here today. I'll introduce them more fully as we go along. We do have Professor Duncan Williams. He'll be speaking first. Then we have Victor Yamada, who will be speaking next. And then we'll have David Inoue, who will also be speaking. And in between, we'll show you a little film because, hey, multimedia is our middle name. So let's talk a little bit. Let me introduce Professor Duncan Williams. Duncan Ryuken Williams is a Soto Zen Buddhist priest, chair and professor of the University of Southern California School of Religion, and director of the USC Shinso Ito Center for Japanese Religions and Culture. Williams is the author of American Sutra about Buddhism and the World War II Japanese American incarceration, The Other Side of Zen, and editor of 7 books on race, religion, and American belonging. Most recently, he served as a co-curator of the Sutra and Bible, Faith in the World War II Japanese American Incarceration exhibit at the Japanese American National Museum, and is directing the building of the Ire Names Monument, a memorial to honor those of Japanese ancestry who were incarcerated in America's internment and concentration camps during World War II. Professor Duncan Williams.
Rod, thank you so much. So, thank you. I'm so honored to be with all of you and with this particular, distinguished panelists. And so, as Rod was saying, I'm going to just break the rules a moment and go backwards for 1 second, one slide really, and talk about this story that this was maybe 22 years ago, I suppose, at this juncture, when the family of this Buddhist priest, Reverend Daisho Tana, who had, prior to the war, served Longpark Buddhist Temple, they approached me to translate their father's wartime diaries. If you can read the Japanese, it says Santa Fe Rosebagu Yokuryusho Nikki. And so it's his time that he spent in both Lordsburg, New Mexico, and the Santa Fe, New Mexico internment camps. And I just wanted to just briefly mention, because we've talked about historical markers, monuments, that kind of thing, about what the internees themselves were thinking back in World War II. And here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you can see that he was very concerned about those who passed away in the camps, because he and quite a few other Buddhist priests were often performing funerals and memorial services. And when he moves from Lordsburg to Santa Fe, you see this entry from June 21st, that he went to the camp authorities to get permission to dig up the bones of 3 people, Yahei Shiota, Hiroto Isomura, and Takeo Takehara, who had been buried in the Lordsburg Cemetery, and he wanted to move them. And why? He said, I did this with the thought that we might need to build a muen. Muen in Japanese means those without relatives to, it means connections or relatives to kind of honor them, that a muen tombstone, something to honor them after the war. And then another entry talks about doing a ceremony in the Santa Fe camp hospital, because he himself is getting so ill that he's worried that he's not going to make it out of camp. But he's worried about everybody dying in camp and that nobody will remember them in the future. And so part of what I want to talk about today, this kind of remembrance, and especially recalling not like numbers, but people and their names. And so let me talk a little bit about some of the ways in which back in World War II, people did funerals in camp. They made monuments themselves. So this is probably the iconic one, that if you know anything about the World War II Japanese American conflict, you know about the Manzanar Ireto, because it still stands there very, 15 feet high and tall. So this is a sketch from Reverend Nagatomi's collection at the Manzanar Circle site. And I think this image is also fairly familiar to those who've studied the World War II Japanese American incarceration and internment history. And he wrote those characters on the monument back in World War II. If you can read Japanese, it's I, to. To means a tower. I means to console. And Re means the spirits. And it's the spirits of those who've recently passed away, but also spirits of anyone who's gone before, meaning the ancestors. And so back in World War II, this idea of kind of doing monuments to console the spirits of those who've gone before, but also in I think many traditions, religious traditions, it's also to console the spirits of those who left behind. And that's how these monuments got built back in World War II. And this morning there was mention of Patrick Nagatani. And so here's some photos of his about Manzanar. And then in Rower, in 1944, a different Buddhist priest, Reverend Daitetsu Hayashima, was responsible for building the one that still remains in the Rower, Arkansas concentration camp in the one that was built in 1944. And I know Mitch Holm in the room, so I wanted to mention the Ireto, that his great-grandfather, Hikowada, a pastor in the American Baptist Christian tradition, was involved, also using the same characters, Ire-to. So that idea of kind of honoring, and in that case, it's not just those who passed away in camp, but honoring those who served in the US military from the Amachi concentration camp in Colorado. And there's a wooden board that lists all of their names. In Minidoka, they had a similar thing called the Honor Roll, a monument built during the war, also to keep track of the names of those who had passed away, not only in camp, but in the service of defending America. And so why is name so important? I go back to the earliest history of Japanese American, immigration. When Japanese Americans first started landing on the Hawaiian Islands, they were working on the sugar plantations, and at that time they didn't receive, it's like Yamaguchi, Yamashita, it's too confusing. So they just had these little numbers, and they called them bango, which in Japanese just means numbers. And that's how they were referred to. And as you know, that gets replicated with the numbers that families were tagged with, alien numbers that people were kind of processed with during World War II. It's a kind of like, if you think about what was the difference between the Japanese and the German Italian American experience, it's German Italian nationals were also interned, right? But that kind of idea of like kind of guilt by association, the kind of like lack of individuality, the kind of whole community being kind of seen as a undifferentiated mass. I think that's what was some of the differences between what happened with the communities. And so the idea of giving the names back to me is a form of healing or repairing that history. And I want to talk quickly now about moving forward. I think many of you know, in DC, the Vietnam War Memorial, the New York City, the 9/11 Memorial, and most probably relevant for what I'm trying to talk about is the lynching memorial, colloquially known in Alabama, where all those who experienced that kind of racial terrorism of lynching in the American South, their names were often, out of sight. And finally, there was a monument to their names that was built in Alabama. And so, and here's another shot of it. And so I'm hoping with the cooperation of many, many other people, I'm calling it the Inoue Names Monument Project, that kind of national project to build at the former various kinds of confinement sites at the Army and DOJ and WRA sites, various campsites, as well as the Japanese American National Museum, a names monument. And the first problem is that there's not been a comprehensive master list of every single person in all of these different types of camps, whether they're located in Hawaii or in Arkansas, run by different kinds of agencies. No one's ever put a full list together. Even the Office of Redress Administration, the ORA, they about 81,000 redress checks, but I interviewed people in that office who were like, yeah, we didn't have Excel back then, and the paper files everywhere, and it was a little bit chaotic. And they did have lists, and so one of the things is, and wonderful, Victor here and his wife, and then Shelley. There's lots of wonderful people who've been doing the work of making names lists for, at least here in New Mexico, for Lordsburg and Santa Fe, Fort Stanton, et cetera. And so that's a part of the process. First, let's just get the history right. Let's get everybody's name. Let's not leave anybody out. And also let's spell people's names right, because World War II, Army typists and whatever, it's a lot of mistakes. And so we're trying to correct the record, repair the record. And we also are drawing from internally created directories, not just government records, but the ones including Japanese language records where people are knowing their names. And that's how often we correct the spellings by looking at what the internees themselves did. And you can see, this one must be from Fort Lincoln. And so we're putting these things together. And then once you have it, how do you display it? And so the project involves 3 different ways of displaying all of those names. One is a book called the Ireicho. One is a virtual memorial or website called Ireizo. And finally, Ireihi, the kind of art installation where we'll display the names. And so the book is basically just the names. It comes from, in the Japanese tradition, there's something called kakocho. Literally means, kaku means past. Cho means a registry or book. A book of the past, a registry of the past. We put the names of all the people in there. For example, when we do our ceremonies and when we honor and dedicate our rituals, we name their names. And so this one is not about which camps, it's not a database. It's just a respectful way to honor each name. And so that's one form that it'll take. Another form is have a website, because then you can have information about people's, whether the camp and other information about and search it alphabetically and so on. So that's another way to do it. And then finally, this Ireihi, a kind of monument, or in a more traditional sense, but based on this Japanese traditional kind of way of thinking about repair and reparation. It comes from a ceramic repair tradition called kintsugi. Tsugi comes from the verb tsugu, to join again, and kin means gold. It's like if you break a teacup or a favorite plate, instead of throwing it away, we put lacquer and rejoin it. And instead of hiding the cracks and the breakage, we put gold on it. And that records the history of that teacup or plate. And so in the same kind of idea, our thought was to build a monument that has that kind of idea of acknowledging the past and thereby healing it. Not just a monument as a, structure of remembrance, but an active act of repair. And so we're also trying to use, if you think about Vietnam War or more, like there's 125,000 names of persons of Japanese ancestry incarcerated. We can't buy a place to build so we're using light technology, projection, to scroll through 125,000 names in a 60-minute light show. I'm going to wrap up in 1 second here. And so structurally, we're gonna try to design it, by tradition a little bit, referencing some of the World War II things of the Gorinto, the five, like the Rower one and the Manzanar especially have these 5-tier structures. And then we're going to, this is a kind of very early conceptual design of it, of putting the names in a scrolling manner on this monument, and where the cracks, once we have people start to acknowledge it, correct mistakes of spelling, or people who we hope we're 99% correct, but if we're wrong in any way, missing anybody, that this record actually gets corrected over time. And it's easier to do it when you have a computer algorithm that can screen the name. So the last thought I'm going to leave you with is I'm going to go back to Santa Fe. Reverend Kyoshiro Tokunaga, who post-war served at San Jose Buddhist Temple, when he was on the train here, he was quite physically, ill. And there was an African-American train porter who nursed him back to health. And in addition to physically kind of getting him better, they began talking about their current experiences, but also history of, exclusion and racism and being, classed as second-class persons in this nation. And after the war, he became very involved in talking about the linkages between the Japanese American experience and the Black American experience. And when redress for the Japanese, earlier today, there was talk about the 1988 Civil Liberties Act that President Ronald Reagan signed, but he was the only Issei, or person in a Department of Justice camp like Santa Fe, who was part of the NC JAR lawsuit that was also part of the whole kind of movement for acknowledging the past and repairing it. And so he used these words in that period. He said, there is not just a karma to, if I do something bad, there's a negative reaction or positive, like an individual's karma, but a karma to a nation. And I think I wanted to leave with that thought, that we inherit, whether we like it or not, whatever our backgrounds, whether we're, by blood connected to this history or not, that we have a kind of connectedness or interlinkedness as a community where we inherit the karma of our nation, the racial hurts, the break lines and fissures, that if we don't repair them, rejoin them, and somehow adorn them, and remember them, I think we'll get lost as a nation. So that's kind of where I want to leave it. I know the other panelists will kind of take it from there and talk about what's happening here locally as well as nationally. So thank you.
Duncan, thank you so much. That was awesome. That was really good. It kind of leads me into a question, which I know the other guys are going to answer, because you mentioned about rejoining and remembering, and what are the other ways that one can do that. So with that, I want to now turn to Victor Yamada, who is going to talk a little bit about the New Mexico activities since the time of the camp closing to now, moving us forward in the current times. Victor Yamada has served as Special Projects Director for New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League. He led the Confinement in Land of Enchantment, Japanese Americans in New Mexico during World War II, Traveling Exhibit, and Community Forums project. He retired from a professional career as Environmental Policy and Compliance Manager with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, consulting organizations, chemical manufacturing company, and a California energy utility. Victor?
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we get here we are. Perfect timing. One supplement to Rod's introductory comment. Again, as those of you who've sat through the entire day, I think you'll see that our discussions are complementary. We're telling parts of the total story, but we do it in a complementary way. And I can assure you, we haven't coordinated to the nth degree. So somehow our process, I think, works, and we're covering the topic, and I think we're maybe repeating things, but I think that way you will remember, and you'll also see some of the connections. So, with that also, I'm very grateful to be on this panel with actually two national leaders, Duncan and David, and their discussions on remembering and honoring, and David's talk about national issues and activism. What I'm going to talk about briefly is, as Rod said, the New Mexico activities, the local activities from camps closing to the current times. And when I say local activities, I'm going to be touching mostly on historical documentation, education, and activism. And this is really involving the New Mexico JCL, the Japanese American community, and our supporters. Next slide. The New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League had its beginnings in 1947, first with the Albuquerque Nisei Club, and then evolved into the New Mexico chapter, and has been operational and active since that time frame. We're now part of the Pacific Southwest region of JCL. One of the important meetings that our chapter was involved in, the JCL Mountain Plains meeting, and the local chapter hosted that in Albuquerque in 1984. And what was significant about that was that Min Yasui spoke about redress legislation at that meeting. And he was on the same panel with Senator Domenici of New Mexico. And through his passionate appeal, he won the support of the senator to support the federal legislation on redress and also on the funding. So that's a part that New Mexico can be proud of. Next slide. I'll spend a couple of slides on one of our main important projects for the JCL, Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, Japanese Americans in New Mexico during World War II. And this project has been spanning over 10 years. The purpose is to reach a wide and diverse audience in New Mexico and the United States about histories of Japanese American internment in the state, inspire thought and conversation about issues of citizenship, identity, civil liberty. The team included Colorado State University, Central New Mexico Community College, the JCL chapter, other volunteers, other organizations and institutions, and with significant funding by the National Park Service. Next slide. Briefly, the project scope included research and documentation of the 4 New Mexico sites, installation of historic markers at Baca Camp, Camp Lordsburg, Fort Stanton, the preparation of an outreach publication that included historical context, camp histories, internee stories, community experiences. And the project publication is this, and it's available if you're interested in the museum shop. The project also developed a website or a story map, and includes a summary of the material in the publication, maps and additional photos, videos, and links to a lot of the extra project materials. And that's still available online. And then next, development of the traveling exhibit and the holding of community forums. And these were displayed and showed in Lordsburg, Santa Fe, and Fort Stanton. Next slide. A bit more on the traveling exhibit and the forums. The exhibit was designed, constructed, and transported to the venues. And the exhibit was shown, as I mentioned before, at Lordsburg Museum, the Santa Fe Public Library, and the Fort Stanton Historic Site. I should mention that part of this exhibit is currently on display in the Palace of Governors, room 15. The community forums were held at each location during the exhibit opening. During our site visit, during our event at Fort Stanton, we also added a site visit to the Baca camp. And we were fortunate to have Roy Ibahara, who was one of the survivors from Clovis, who were housed in Baca camp. Roy led the site tour, so he was able to recall his childhood experiences and point out a few of the physical remains that still exist there at the camp. And we have a film documenting this phase in preparation. In fact, the filmmaker, Corey Kobayashi, is in the back filming this particular session. We have compiled a prisoner roster, as Duncan mentioned, and this is prepared from the National Archives. And again, in our display in room 15, we do have a binder that contains this prisoner roster. So if you're interested in physically seeing a list of names and some of their accompanying information, that's available in room 15. We had oral interviews of prisoners and relatives. We had a Lordsburg prisoner's diary, which was translated from Japanese to English by our chapter members. Lordsburg and Santa Fe prisoners' letters home. And these are Mr. Hanazawa's letters back to his family in Hawaii. And again, these were translated from Japanese to English by our chapter members. Those two, the diary and the prisoners' letters, are in the History Museum collection. So Santa Fe prisoners' rock collection that was donated by the family, Mr. Takeuchi's family, to the History Museum. And a collection of those rocks also are in room 15 for you to view if you're interested. They're very well done, and I think you'll appreciate the quality of the work, and then also the situation where it was done by a prisoner while he was at Santa Fe. There's also a Santa Fe prisoners scrap album, I think separate from one that maybe Gail mentioned, but this was maintained by Dr. Ben Tanaka, who was at Santa Fe, and his family donated the original to the History Museum. So it's in the collection here. Also mentioned that we have an art collection that was donated by Patrick Nagatani and his colleagues. The other, which I'll refer to again, is that Duncan mentioned Reverend Tana's, who was the Buddhist priest, and his maintaining of a daily library, which was what, four volumes, I believe, and a copy of that diary exists in the History Museum collection. The good part and the bad part is that that's all in Japanese. So you can talk to Duncan. He has translated part of that, as he mentioned. So some of that is accessible for those that are interested in more an appreciation of that diary. Next slide. As we've carried forward with the CLO project, and as results, we've given a number of related individual talks, and I'll list a few that are representative of those that we've given. We've talked at the Los Alamos Historical Museum. We've talked to the Army Bombardment Group reunion that was held in Albuquerque last year. The Historic Santa Fe Foundation, in conjunction with the National Holocaust Museum traveling exhibit, which was shown at the Rio Rancho Library, we gave our talk. And also in conjunction with the Smithsonian traveling exhibit on the Japanese American internment, which was shown at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, as well as the Brannigan Cultural Center in Las Cruces. So we gave accompanying talks at those locations. I'm down to the last 2 or 3 here. We've given a number of group presentations, and I'll go through a very quick presentation of those that were presented. The first was already appreciated this morning, the JCL Players Readers Theater at various venues. And as you heard the introduction by Gail, Nikki Nojima Lewis is the artistic director. So she and her cast have performed various segments, including Rod, at various locations across the state over the last number of years. And again, we've held Dave Remembrance events. We've had sessions at the New Mexico History Conference in various years. We've presented teacher training workshops on this subject in a number of locations, 3 in Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe. One of the ones in Albuquerque was in conjunction with the educators who were in a session on how to teach the Holocaust. Next slide. Additionally, group presentations, Holly Yasui film tour. She had prepared a documentary on her father, Min Yasui, and so we toured with that. Some of you may know that actually previous to that tour, her father received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Stops in Gallup, we were honored to have as a guest speaker, Hershey Miramura. We also hosted a Go for Broke National Education Center exhibit and activities called Courage and Compassion at the Albuquerque Museum. And then we've participated in the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimage, which was a nationwide virtual program. And then also Nikki and her cohorts participated in the Big Read in Las Cruces last year. Quickly mentioning some Japanese links. We've served as a host to the peace ambassadors from Hiroshima who are affiliated with the World Friendship Center, and that was held at the Albuquerque Center for Peace and Justice. We've been in meetings with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum representatives in the past, and that was held at the Los Alamos History Museum. We've participated, and I should mention above that, part of my personal connection, again, my family roots, on mother's and father's side, are from Hiroshima, so I have a personal attachment to those activities. We participated in the peace celebration, ringing the peace bell, which was a function that was held jointly between the Albuquerque Sister City Foundation and Sasebo. As you may know, Sasebo is near Nagasaki. And go to the next slide. Again, to show our multi-ethnic involvement with Asian Americans. Early on, we did an Asian American legacies story, which was in partnership with the Asian American Association of New Mexico. What we did was interviews of leaders of the Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, and Korean communities. The Gold Mountain Monument, in support of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, Xu Wang was the principal party there. They put together a monument, and the purpose of that monument was to honor a landmark civil rights case that we were challenging the ban on Chinese from testifying in court. And ultimately, that ban was overturned by that lawsuit. The monument itself sits currently at the Bernalillo County Courthouse plaza in the back. We've participated in the past in Stop Anti-Asian Hate rally that was held last year. That was initially led and originated by an Albuquerque City Councilwoman, Lon Senna. Thank you. We've been involved most recently in social justice advocacy, and ties part of what David will talk about. Tsuru For Solidarity is the organization, and part of the protest has been against the incarceration of immigrant children in the U.S. And the demonstrations were at Fort Sill and Fort Bliss, and Nikki Nojima has been our principal representative to those demonstrations. I've mentioned the pop-up exhibit that's in room 15. One of the extra elements that's in there is a portion of the exhibit is on generational legacies. It helps tell the story, again, of the internment, but with individuals involved in their families. And so Ikinojima Lewis is featured, Gail Ogawa is featured, and Jerry West and his father are featured in that exhibit. So if you could drop by, you might find that interesting. And then finally, there's a film documentary made on this anniversary and on the marker challenges. And that's under a Japanese American Community Foundation grant to the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. And as been mentioned before, Claudia Katayanagi is the lead. She's over there, and I knew I would trip over that. So with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Victor. Thanks for giving us a good survey of the local things that are going on. We want to go into the national ones. Also, I want to say I appreciate that you're not the only one who mispronounced names, so don't worry about that. Before we talk, we have David speak to us about national events. Now is the time. I'd like to show you that film about Tsuru For Solidarity. So if we could get that film up and going.
We know that Seattle sent 12,000.
Oh my God, there were so many Seattle boxes.
New York sent over 1,000. Sacramento sent over 1,000.
I got 1,000. I think LA sent about 500.
Yeah. 150 boxes from all over the country. Origami USA jumped in on this.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Origami Therapy Association of New York.
I'm looking at these beautiful cranes and I feel like these are wings of hope on these cranes, a message that the children and the families will get, that there are people on the outside who care, people like Japanese Americans who understand what mass incarceration could mean, and that we're fighting for their release and freedom.
It's at the Family Detention Center. It's the largest detention center in the United States. So I think that this effort really brings the moral voice of people who have impacted this and know what the long-term impact of being incarcerated in these family facilities is.
The family was stripped of our human rights, civil rights. We were never charged with a crime. We were in prison without due process. We don't want this to happen again.
We respectfully acknowledge the presence of Amida Tathagata entering this gathering place as we present these cranes of peace.
undocumented issues, not only Latinx issues or Black issues, it's also Asian American issues. There's more than 1 million documented Asian Americans live in this country without having proper, I would say, rights. So always they're living in fear of deportation.
Thank you for standing in solidarity with our community and joining our voices to push back and say no more concentration camps, no more separating of families, and stop repeating history. Thank you.
I am a Kwahu. Hey, 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 yo, hey, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo, hey, yo.
We're here as representatives of a national Japanese American community who are outraged. We're absolutely outraged that this is happening again, that human beings could be treated this way. So we came here not only to pay homage to our ancestors and even some of the survivors in this room who were incarcerated here in Texas at Crystal City, but we brought cranes. Maybe you can help me bring these up. So we asked our community to fold cranes to bring to Texas, because in our culture, the crane is a symbol of unity and peace and nonviolence. And when you fold 1,000 cranes, it says that heaven grant you a wish for health and prosperity and wellness. These were folded in cities and towns everywhere.
My name is Gene Wu. I'm a state rep out of Houston. I'm only the 5th Asian American in the state's history. So when I first ran for office, one of my big supporters was a man named Glenn Gondo. Glenn, I'm a Democrat, and Glenn's a Republican. You know, I was kind of like concerned, like, you know, it's like, hey, why are you supporting me? You know, because I know you're a Republican, and you know, and he tells me the story of, you know, when his family went through the internment camps, and he told me, I don't ever want to be. I don't ever want to be unable to speak, to have someone come and say, this is wrong. Sorry. And that's why, I really want to say something to all of y'all, because I know you guys are from California, from New York, from all over the place. You didn't have to be here. But it means a lot to me that you're here, because it's when nobody speaks, it's when we can take the people with no voice. It's when we take the people who can easily be stepped on and nobody will say anything or raise their hand. That's when democracy dies. That's when our liberty dies. And thank you for being here, fighting for people who have no voice. Thank you for being here to fight for not just people in our own community, but other places that need your help and need someone to speak out for them. And I'm sorry, I'm just a mess right now.
No ban, no walls, no camps, no help, no ban, no walls, no camps, no help, no ban, no walls, no camps, no help.
This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to a dramatic scene that unfolded Saturday when 5 Japanese American elders, survivors of the U.S. internment camps, engaged in civil disobedience outside the Fort Sill Army Post in Oklahoma, where the Trump administration plans to indefinitely detain 1,400 immigrant and refugee children starting next month.
We're here today to protest the repetition of history. We were in American concentration camps. We were held under indefinite detention. We were without due process of law. We were charged without any evidence of being a threat to national security. We hear these exact words today regarding innocent people seeking asylum in this country.
Yes, 77 years has passed. The people look a little different than us, okay? But the fact remains, it's the same shit as before.
You're not allowed to protest on Fort Sill. You can go across the street, and that needs to happen right now.
Otherwise, what will happen?
I don't know. No, I'm not going to arrest you, but you need to move now.
Then we're not going to move.
Yes, you're going to move.
If you're not going to arrest us, we're not going to move.
Yes, I spent 3.5 years at Post in Arizona, an American concentration camp during World War II. The family separation policy, which is ruining the lives of these children. We, the people, have to stand up and protest it.
As a 4-year-old.
It's English. Get out.
And so what we did with here is I had to have this to get out of Mitadoka.
Look, I understand your issues, okay? But you cannot protest on Fort Sill.
We've been removed too many times. We're not leaving.
Even though there is a law within the United States government that says you may not demonstrate in front of a military base if they ask you to leave, that we answer to a higher law. And that's the law of protecting children.
Fort Sill had 90 Buddhist priests as part of the 700 who were incarcerated there. And to honor them, I wanted to participate in today's rally.
Fort Sill is an American concentration camp. Geronimo imprisoned here in 1894 with 341 other Apaches. His death, until his death in 1909.
We've been migrating for thousands of years as a people, and the border is not like we're crossing the border. The border already crossed us.
This is about survival. And we are not supposed to be asking and seeking survival in a country that says we are a melting pot. If something needs to be melted, we need to melt the ice.
We're here today to say this must stop now.
No fear, immigrants are welcome here, no hate. No fear, immigrants are welcome here, no hate.
We're here because back in 1942, 700 Japanese immigrants were held. They were community leaders, separated from their family. Among them, there were 90 Buddhist priests arrested right after Pearl Harbor because they were thought to be a threat to national security. Who can belong? Who's included? Who's excluded? These are struggles that are interlinked between what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, and what is happening today. And we remember these people because usually their names are forgotten. And so we recite them today in our prayer.
Chief White Bear, Kiowa, Geronimo, Apache Chief, Woman's Heart, Kiowa Chief.
I am a grandson of Mexican immigrants that crossed the borders long before visas and green cards. And like every immigrant, they came to this country seeking a better life for themselves and for their children and for their grandchildren. Today, we honor those Japanese internees that died here at the hands of our government in 1942, and to the 10 children whose lives were cut short while in custody of the U.S. Border Patrol.
Tokui Sangayo Yobutu Gechi Sudati Kusho Rangaku Eri.
That film moves us forward in more ways than one. Let's introduce David Inoue. He was appointed Executive Director of the Japanese American Citizens League in July 2017. He previously served for 10 years as the Administrative Director for a medical shelter for homeless men in Washington, D.C. Mr. Inoue worked for several years in healthcare policy with the National Association of Public Hospitals and Health Systems and with the federal government at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. He completed a dual Bachelor of Arts degree in chemistry and Asian studies at Cornell University and obtained master's degrees in public health and health administration from The Ohio State University. A DC resident since 2001, Mr. Inoue has served as an elected advisory neighborhood commissioner and served 1 year as chair of the commission. He currently serves on the boards of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. David.
Thank you, Rod. And actually what Rod did not mention is he's a fellow Cornell alum as well.
Yeah.
We were talking about that yesterday. So a lot of you have learned a lot about Japanese American history today. So what I'm here to ask you all is, what are you going to do about it? I'm here to talk about the activism part of this. The history doesn't really mean anything unless you actually do something about it. You got a lot of that. Nikki's play was a fantastic summary of basically what, about 100 years of Japanese American history. I took it from the early immigration up through redress. When I talk about our experience as Japanese Americans, I sort of think of us, particularly JACL, sort of like a concentric rings, that Japanese American history is kind of the core of what we do, that we're never going to change that part of who JACL is. This is what Tsuru For Solidarity does. This is what we as Japanese Americans, we have that story as the basis for why we talk about civil rights the way that we do. That also happens in the context, though, of our wider Asian American history. And Nikki's play touched on that around the Chinese Exclusion Acts that preceded Japanese American immigration. Following, or actually concurrent with the redress struggle, 40 years ago this year was the murder of Vincent Chin, which was an event that really galvanized the Asian American community as one. And unfortunately, what we're seeing today now, again, is the rise in anti-Asian hate once again in the last couple of years. But then you take that out to another concentric ring, and how does that story fit in with other stories throughout our history. Going back before the Chinese Exclusion Act, a lot of this goes around labor and Japanese labor replacing Chinese. Who were the laborers before the Chinese around the 1860s? It was slavery. And you can see the progression of how this country continues to exploit laborers. And today we see it in the newer immigrant communities. And prior to slavery, we have and concurrent to that, we have the indigenous populations in this country forcibly removed again. And we talk a lot about the removal, the forcing of people from their spaces in this country. And that's what happened to the Native people. It's what happened to Japanese Americans. So you see this connection between our many stories. And out of that is why we talk about solidarity. The other lesson we learned from the incarceration experience, actually, though, is that there wasn't really any solidarity, that Japanese Americans really were sort of on our own. As we mentioned, oftentimes, there was one national organization that did stand up and say what is happening is wrong, and that was the Quakers. Unfortunately, the Quakers are not the most powerful lobby group in Washington, D.C. Not to denigrate the Quakers, but they're not the ACLU, the NAACP, the ADL, all of which existed at that time, but largely remained silent. The labor unions, now today, some of the greatest advocates for civil rights, actually were supportive of the incarceration, largely for economic reasons. We were seen as competition. And so coming out of that experience, there's sort of that recognition that we need to be working with other groups. So one of the things I'm proud of the Japanese American community is that we were there during the civil rights movement, coming out of the 50s, the 60s. The March on Washington, there was a group of JCL members there. You can see them all dressed in their suits on a very hot August day and carrying around the JCL banner. I compare that to a couple years ago when my son and I, during COVID times, went out and represented the JCL, and we were there in our shorts and t-shirts. And it was not quite as formal an affair as it was some 50 plus years ago. But then also, I think the other thing when we look back around solidarity, it's not something that necessarily has come up all of a sudden that Japanese Americans realize this. And I think the other watershed moment was 9/11, when we saw, obviously, the terrorist attacks on this country. And there was a tremendous fear about what might happen to the Muslim community. And Japanese Americans were the first to stand up. And fortunately, we had Secretary Mineta, who was in the White House administration at the time, and had talked to then President Bush about his experience in the camps. And when President Bush went to talk about how are we going to respond as a nation, he mentioned that history in how he wanted our country to respond, and emphasized that we would not respond in the same way that we did to Japanese Americans. That doesn't necessarily mean that Muslims did get off scot-free, and there was a lot of discrimination that they experienced. And we have to recognize that. And it continues to this day. But at the same time, it was an opportunity for us to stand up and speak out. And you saw this also with the Muslim ban that in the Trump administration. You saw thousands of people standing up together, again, in solidarity that what we as a country were doing was wrong. So I don't want to be too negative that obviously we weren't able to stop that from happening, but you didn't see people just rolling over and letting it happen, that there was this vocal minority that was saying that this is wrong and we need to stop it. And what you also saw was that the administration had to keep changing that Muslim ban because it was being challenged. It was being challenged in the courts. And I think they went through, was it 4 or 5 different iterations until they finally got to one where they were able to pass judicial muster. We still disagreed with the decision on that. And you'll see the irony of that is that the Supreme Court actually found validity in the Muslim ban that directly paralleled the finding that they approved the incarceration of Japanese Americans, essentially saying it was the administration's right to sort of do things on the basis of military necessity. It was not the place of the court to question whether that military necessity actually exists or not. And that was exactly what they said in the Korematsu case. At the same time, the court also repudiated Korematsu, which I think many of us found very ironic and kind of ridiculous that they were doing that. So the other thing during the previous administration you saw was this issue of immigrant detention, where we saw children who were being swept up into camps. And the images of those camps, they weren't the barracks of World War II, but there were images of these tents that they were putting in, essentially, very sort of permanent tents in some way, laid out in rows exactly like the barracks at any of the 10 major camps. So this really struck a chord, I think, in many Japanese Americans that this really is happening again. And when we say never again, we want to really mean never again, but it really was something that was happening. And there's a sort of like, how can we stop this? And JCL, we work in Washington, D.C. The challenge is, when you're working with an administration that does not want to listen to you, they won't even take your calls, essentially. How do you get through to them? And it is this, how can we do something publicly? And this is where Tsuru For Solidarity really came in creating a powerful visual of bringing these thousands of cranes to the various locations to protest this. And it really did raise the consciousness of many people. And you did see, actually, this was one of the few times during the administration where there was actually bipartisan agreement that, yes, incarcerating children is not a good look for our country. It didn't last long. Pretty soon they fell into the entrenched positions. But it was initially something that we did have some success with. Unfortunately, the incarceration of children does continue today, and the administration today, we continue to press them that, look, this is not something that this is not what we fought for when we fought against the previous administration, and we expected better from you all. So it is something that we still need to work on. Granted, the current administration is working to get more of those children out of these larger facilities and into what are considered to be better practices, but it is something that is still a struggle. The other area, which you're probably seeing in the news right now, is this issue called Title 42. It is a public health law. My background is actually in public health, so this is something that has really interested me in the past 2 years, basically. This is something where, again, because of the COVID health emergency, we declared that on this basis, we are going to exclude people from coming into this country. We're not going to allow immigrants in, and we're also going to use this to deport and exclude people who we don't want coming into this country. It's something that we believe that the current administration would remove as soon as they came in. It has taken a long time. They finally announced that they're going to do this. And now we see members of Congress now saying that they are going to withhold public health funding unless this policy remains in place. So this is another policy where you can talk about how this country has in the past used policy incorrectly to achieve a different means when there really is no need for that policy. There was no security threat for Japanese Americans. Similarly, I think we can all agree, many of us are here without masks on today. The public health threat is not a reason to be keeping people out of this country. And then finally, in more modern history, we have the topic of redress. And that has meant so many things around the issue of reparations. One of the lessons, I think, you sort of heard it in that video about Tsuru. One of the remaining lessons that we as a community learned is that we actually did some horse trading around redress and excluded some groups, the Japanese Latin Americans in particular, from receiving redress. And that's a problem that we are now trying to remedy today even, that there are still people surviving who are deserving of redress and did not get it. The broader story also is that of Black reparations, that we achieved our redress, what, close to 40 years ago. It has now been 400 years since the beginning of slavery, and we have still not addressed that since the end of the Civil War. There's a question, do we ever actually end slavery at the Civil War as well? I mean, I think we can all agree that the discrimination that Blacks have faced has continued to this day, which again brings us to Tsuru, where through COVID, we had built these plans to actually have a pilgrimage of Japanese Americans to Washington, D.C. To protest what was happening with immigrant children. COVID then hit. We canceled those plans. And then about a month before we had planned to have sort of smaller events across the country, George Floyd was murdered. And there was that recognition that when we talk about solidarity, we really need to emphasize our solidarity with the Black community, whether it be through reparations, through justice reform, that we as Japanese Americans, our achievements, redress would not have been possible without the support of the Black community, without support of the Jewish community. And it was now our turn to turn around and say that we need to speak out on this issue. So this has also become a big issue for Japanese Americans in just the past couple of years. It's something that we've been focused on for the now many years since redress passed. But we really want to see basically a commission similar to what was established for Japanese Americans to now be established for to look at Black reparations. We actually got to 215 possible yes votes in the House. You need, what is it, 218 for anything to pass. So we don't feel like we're that far off, but we're unable to get the House to actually bring this to a vote because they believe the politics are not right, that if we force people to vote on this, it's going to look bad in the midterm elections. A lot of this always comes down to we don't want to seem too radical on things. I don't think it's a radical thing to say we owe people for the stain of slavery. So when we talk about how important our history is, it is in the context of all the other history that's happened around us, that is continuing to happen. Also, that we don't just take what we hear today and just walk out and think, yeah, that is what happened in the past. It is still happening today, and we need to do something about it. So my charge to you all is to take what you've learned today about Japanese Americans. This is part of your history, whether it's part of your Santa Fe history, your New Mexico history, or American history. But it is yours as well. And it's your right and responsibility to talk about it, to share it, and use it to talk about these other issues where there are so many direct parallels. So thank you very much, and go out and change the world.
Thank you, David. Great. Loved it. Now, in true activist fashion, I ran this panel a little long, but I'm wondering if they would let me have at least one question. Wow, generous. Aiko was looking at me with those eyes of like, it's time. And I returned her look with these eyes, which basically said, if you're not going to arrest me, I'm not moving. So who's got some questions for this wonderful panel here? Anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Oh. I'm used to talking with the microphone really close, so I'll pull it away. Thank you all for your stories and just activism in general. I really appreciate your making the connections to other movements. I think it's really important. We tend to forget about that in Santa Fe. I feel like I did want to make one comment that I hope that when you're doing some research related to the Japanese experience, my sister is a historian in New Mexico history, and she does, she's done research on sanctuary movements in New Mexico. Obviously, we're a sanctuary city in Santa Fe, but she's looking at it from a lot of different perspectives, from religious sanctuary, from cultural sanctuary, from even sanctuary related to health. And I wanted to let you know that there was a movement to have a Japanese community of sanctuary in Maxwell, New Mexico. And I was talking to Aiko about it, and I was just hoping maybe someone could look into that further, because I think that's an important part of our history that shows about the history of sanctuary in New Mexico in general. So I just want to make that point. And then the other pieces that I think are connections to what you're talking about is the tricultural myth of New Mexico. We tend to talk about our 3 different cultures that made up our history of New Mexico. And I want to encourage everybody to reject that, because that's not our history. That is a dominant population, but there's a history of Japanese or Asian Pacific Islander history in New Mexico. There's a history of Black communities in New Mexico and beyond. So I always want to encourage that. We really, really focus on that, especially in Santa Fe. And I want to think about it broader, that we have more of our history than just the tricultural myth. And then one last thing related to like removal of people, and we're thinking about what that looks like in history, is gentrification in Santa Fe is a form of removal of indigenous and traditional people. And we're seeing it again with the housing prices. And I just want us to all acknowledge like our contributions to that, being here, and then also what's happening with the increase of housing and the need for affordable housing. So let your elected officials know that anytime the city has land, we should build affordable housing no matter what, because we don't want to be repeating history. Gentrification is part of the history of Santa Fe.
Thank you all. I'm a plant in the audience. And I wanted to especially ask Victor about a wonderful story that happened in Clovis, New Mexico, and how student activism and passion made a real difference in the community. So if you could relate that story, Victor, it's a very heartwarming one.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, what I'm trying to figure out is how to keep the answer short. And I'll try to do it in a few sentences. One of the 4 sites that I touched on was Baca Camp, and that was specifically set up to house those residents of Clovis who were picked up in January of 1942 and removed to Baca Camp. These were the adults who worked for the railroad company and their children. So it was a mixture of Japanese immigrants and Japanese American citizens that were picked up by the government. I think the extra part of the story that the person from the audience is pointing to is that that story in a lot of places, including Clovis, was not known. And actually a number of the parties who helped institute discovery of that story are in the audience. There's a couple of history professors at the Central New Mexico Community College that included that chapter of Japanese American internment in New Mexico, including Clovis. And one of the students who happened to be from Clovis said, "I'd never heard of that before." And he rushed back to the city and asked around and found, yes, that was true. And he started a movement personally to have the city council recognize that chapter of history, and even so far as to provide an apology to the Clovis residents. And one of the big events that was generated by that push was that 3 of the survivors were brought back to Clovis, and they were named as grand marshals of the yearly parade in Clovis. So a formal apology and a formal recognition as grand marshals of the city parade. So it's a recognition of that small incarceration, but still an incarceration, and that some folks in the city recognized that that was wrong, and you had an activist who pushed that. And I think it's one of the few cities or jurisdictions within the country that has formally given an apology to individual Japanese Americans for the incarceration. Sorry, that was more than 5 sentences.
Thank you, Victor.
Well, I spoke in my welcoming comments about the role of the museum as a place of memory and stories. And I have a feeling that this is a little rhetorical. But doing these kinds of gatherings like this seems to me to be something that is appropriate for the museum to do. Not only for continuing the story that has to do with Japanese American internment, but some of the larger circles of things that we've talked about. So should we continue to do this?
Actually, I was going to address that. There's a question on the previous panel about what can we do about historic preservation. And there is a lot you can do to preserve history. One is, before you leave today, make a donation to the museum, thanking them for hosting this event today. At the federal level, what we do a lot with is the National Park Service, for example, because they do a lot of the cultural preservation. Now, we think of national parks as Yosemite or Yellowstone, but a lot of what they do are places like Manzanar. Just recently, Amachi in Colorado has just become a new national park. So it is also supporting preservation of these sites through both federal, state, local. There is a program, actually the Confinements in the land of Enchantment, that was funded partially by a JAX grant, which is through the National Park Service as well. Similarly, there are programs for Black history. There's also proposals now in the House to look at Hispanic history, Asian American history. As we hear so many people talking about wokeness and critical race theory and not wanting to talk about these things in schools, push back on that. Talk about how important it is that we do learn about our full history as Americans. That it's not a negative. Yes, it is negative to learn these things that happen, but it is a part of our history. And the whole point of it is recognizing that we're learning from that. I learn about Japanese American incarceration, but also learn about redress. That yes, what we did to Japanese Americans was an awful thing, but we as a nation also have that capacity to apologize and to try and make right. It's what we're trying to do with HR 40. So push back whenever someone says that we don't want to hear those things, that is a part of our history.
And if I could just follow up on that, I think in partly in response to the councilwoman's comments about voices that aren't heard and have been marginalized. When I talk about the museum doing this, I'm saying that there's certain kinds of things we can do. We can provide a venue, we can provide support, but this couldn't happen without community involvement. And so I want to acknowledge that community and just say that continuing forward is about talking and involving more communities in this history, in all of our history, and learning from them. So that's a good takeaway for me, and that's a pledge in terms of what I'm going to do as an activist.
So I just want to quickly appreciate all of you. Such gratitude. I know I'm going to see you up at the marker. Also, we have with us Claudia Katayanagi and Satsuki Murashige, who are completing a documentary on this whole process and what's happened with the marker. She's got a goal of 10,000 on a GoFundMe page, and it's Santa Fe Internment Camp Community. Marker Community in Conflict. So do go to that GoFundMe page if you can. It's going to be an incredible film in terms of another educational outreach and dialogue tool. So thank you and see you in a while.
Okay, Gail, before you do that, if I can just thank this panel. Please. Thank you very much. If I see that there were a couple more questions. Feel free to catch these guys after they'll be around. They'll also be on the pilgrimage, and I'm sure they'd be happy to talk to you. So thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, we are running a little late. So what we'd like to do at this point is to honor and celebrate the long life of Kiku Kato. She was one of the original marker committee members.